At my son's rehearsal dinner, his future mother-in-law picked up her champagne glass, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "We're so grateful Kevin found someone to look up to, even if it's just a retired janitor." The table went quiet. Her husband smiled into his napkin. My son looked at his plate. I took a slow sip of water and said nothing. But I was already thinking. Before I tell you what happened next, I need to go back 3 months to when this whole thing started. My son's name is Kevin. He's 31, works in commercial real estate, good at his job, better than he gives himself credit for. His fiancée is Amber, and I'll be honest with you. I liked Amber from the moment I met her. Warm eyes, easy laugh, the kind of person who asks how you're doing and actually waits for the answer. Whatever I'm about to tell you, none of it is about Amber. It's about her mother, Claudette. Claudette Voss runs a private wealth management firm out of Scottsdale. Her husband, Preston, is semi-retired from commercial banking. They live in a house with a circular driveway and a guest suite larger than the apartment I raised Kevin in after his mother passed. I knew all of this before I ever shook their hands, because Kevin had been carefully preparing me for weeks. "Dad, they're a little formal. Just, dress nicely." I'm 63 years old. I know how to dress for dinner. The first meeting was at a steakhouse in Old Town Scottsdale, the kind of place where they don't put prices on the menu unless you ask. I wore my gray blazer, the one I'd had tailored in 2019 for Kevin's college graduation. I drove my Civic, which is 11 years old, and runs perfectly fine. Preston stood when I walked in. Firm handshake, direct eye contact. I respected that. Claudette remained seated. She assessed me the way a buyer at auction assesses a piece of furniture. Quickly, thoroughly, and with a result already in mind before I sat down. "Kevin tells us you worked for the county," she said. No preamble, just that. 32 years, I said. "Environmental compliance. I was the department head for the last 14. Oh, her smile didn't change. We thought it was something more maintenance related. Kevin was always a little vague about it. I glanced at Kevin. He was studying the breadbasket. The dinner moved the way those things do when one person has decided on the outcome. Preston was pleasant enough, asked about fishing, mentioned he'd been to Sedona. Claudette steered every conversation back to their world. The firm, their clients, their upcoming trip to the Azores, the wedding venue they'd already chosen without asking me. When I mentioned a regulatory case my department had handled that made the Arizona Republic, Claudette nodded with the patience of someone being told about a child's school play. The check came. I reached for it. Preston waved me off with the kind of generosity that isn't really generosity. "Please," he said, "you're our guest." He said it the way you'd say it to someone who couldn't afford the alternative. Kevin walked me to my car afterward. He seemed relieved. "That went well," he said. "Did it?" He looked at me. "Dad, they're used to a certain kind of thing." I drove home with the windows down even though it was February and cold. My hands were steady on the wheel, but I was starting to understand the shape of what I was walking into. The wedding planning accelerated quickly after that. Amber called me twice to talk through details. She was thoughtful about it, always asking if I was comfortable with this or that. Claudette called once to inform me that the rehearsal dinner would be at the Arizona Biltmore, black tie optional, and that the guest list is necessarily intimate given the venue. I asked what that meant. She said the seating had been finalized. I asked if my brother's family would be there. She said space was limited. My brother Gerald had driven 8 hours when Kevin was born. He'd been at every birthday, every graduation, every hard year after Karen died. Space is limited didn't cover it. I called Kevin that evening. He answered on the first ring, which told me Amber had warned him. Dad, is my brother invited to my son's wedding?" Silence. "Kevin, it's a small ceremony, Dad. Amber's family is large and the venue has a capacity, and Claudette offered to cover everything, and she has a vision. Does your uncle know he's not invited? I was going to call him. It's been 6 weeks since the invitations went out. More silence. I know, I'm sorry. I'll call him tonight. I hung up and stood in my kitchen for a long moment. Then I walked to the back bedroom, the one I use as an office, and pulled a filing box from the shelf. Not because I needed anything from it yet. Just because old habits are hard to break. When I spent 3 decades tracking environmental violations, I learned early that the best time to start building a file is before you think you need one. I had a cup of coffee and I wrote 3 names on a legal pad: Claudette, Preston, Voss Wealth Management. Below that, one question: what are they hiding, and do they think I'm too simple to look? I wasn't angry yet. Anger is loud and wastes energy. I was focused. The next morning, I drove to the county recorder's office. Old habit. I know every clerk in that building from 32 years of pulling permits and property records. I asked about business filings for Voss Wealth Management and its registered agents. The woman at the counter pulled it up in 4 minutes. I photographed the screen. Registered in 2003. Claudette Voss listed as principal. One compliance notice, 2018, Arizona Department of Financial Institutions, resolved with a consent agreement. Consent agreements mean someone admitted enough to settle before a hearing. I made a note. That afternoon, I called an old colleague from the county, a woman named Pat who'd moved to the state AG's office 7 years ago. We'd worked 3 cases together in the 2000s. She owed me a favor. She'd never forget because I'd helped her avoid a wrongful termination suit that would have ended her career. I didn't invoke that. I just said I was looking into a financial firm and asked what channels existed for a concerned party to raise questions about advisory practices. She told me what I needed to know. She was careful, professional, and thorough. 20 minutes later, I had a very clear picture of the Arizona Department of Insurance's complaint process and the SEC's FINRA broker check system. I went home and spent 2 hours on FINRA. Every registered advisor leaves a trail. Voss Wealth Management had 2 disclosure events. One customer dispute in 2015, settled for $62,000, and one regulatory action in 2019, a written warning from FINRA for failure to supervise. Both were public record. Neither was criminal. But they were exactly the kind of thing that a firm's clients might want to know about, and exactly the kind of thing a firm like that would work very hard to keep off their dinner table conversation. I printed everything, organized it into a manila folder. Then I set it on the shelf and went back to my normal routine. The rehearsal dinner was on a Friday in April. I wore a suit I'd bought in 2021 for my department retirement luncheon. Charcoal wool, well-fitted, nothing extravagant. I drove to the Biltmore and handed my keys to the valet without comment. Claudette greeted me in the entrance hall. Air kiss, practiced warmth. Sylvester, you made it. She'd been calling me Sylvester for 3 months despite being corrected twice. My name is Stewart. I'd stopped correcting her. Preston shook my hand. Amber hugged me and whispered, "I'm glad you're here, Dad." And that steadied something in my chest that had been tilting all day. They'd seated me at a round table near the edge of the room, away from the family cluster near the head table. My table mates were a couple from Preston's side who smiled politely and immediately turned to each other. I spent the first 20 minutes watching the room. The dinner moved through courses. Claudette worked the tables like a politician at a fundraiser, touching shoulders, leaning in, deploying that warm honey voice she used when she wanted something. Kevin sat at the head table between Amber and Preston, doing his best impression of someone comfortable. Then came the champagne toast. Claudette rose. She spoke beautifully about Amber's childhood, about the family they'd built, about what they hoped for in Kevin, all of it genuine, all of it warm. I was almost moved. Then she turned to me, a small smile, a tilt of the glass. "We're so grateful Kevin found someone to look up to, even if it's just a retired janitor." A light laugh. Bless his heart, he's been talking about his father for years. Laughter rippled through the table, polite, uncertain. Preston chuckled. Kevin's face went still. Amber's hand moved to Kevin's arm, but she didn't say anything. She was 27 and in love and surrounded by her family. I understood the position she was in. I took a slow sip of water. I didn't look at Claudette. I looked at Kevin. He met my eyes for a moment, then looked away. That told me everything. After dinner, I shook hands, thanked the hosts, hugged Amber, and walked to my car. The valet brought the Civic around. I sat in the parking lot for 10 minutes without starting the engine. When I got home, I went straight to the office, pulled out the manila folder, and set it on the desk beside my laptop. I didn't open it yet. I made coffee, changed out of the suit, and sat down at the kitchen table with a fresh legal pad. I wrote one question: what is the appropriate response to calculated contempt? Then I wrote the answer below it: accurate, documented, and perfectly legal. The wedding was in 3 weeks. I had time. I spent the first week on research. Not rage, not grievance, research. I reviewed every document I'd gathered. The FINRA disclosures, the consent agreement with the state, the 2018 compliance notice. Then I pulled property records on the Voss home in Paradise Valley. $3.4 million purchase in 2017, renovated twice since, permitted through the county. I cross-referenced against business tax filings. Nothing that jumped out, but a pattern of aggressive home office deductions caught my attention. A residence that size on filings that showed 60% claimed for business use. That seemed like a number worth questioning. I called the tax attorney I'd worked with during my career, a man named Calvin Bright who'd consulted for the county on property disputes. I laid out what I had. He listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. These deductions, he said finally, they're legal on paper but aggressive. The home office percentage especially. If the IRS looked carefully, they'd have questions. What would make them look carefully? A well-documented complaint with specific code references. IRC Section 280A is your friend. The IRS doesn't love seeing residential square footage applied to business deductions at that scale without ironclad substantiation. He paused. This would take a few months to move through the system. I have time, I said. The consultation ran 90 minutes. I paid $600 in cash and drove home through an afternoon rainstorm, the wipers working steadily, my mind working the same way. The second week, I drafted the complaints. 3 of them. 1 to the IRS, detailed, specific, code-referenced, 12 pages. 1 to FINRA, noting the pattern of undisclosed disclosure events in client-facing materials. I'd found their advisory website and confirmed that neither the 2015 settlement nor the 2019 written warning appeared anywhere in their public bios. That's a FINRA Rule 220 issue around communications with the public. The third was to the Arizona Department of Insurance, restating the pattern from the 2018 consent agreement and noting that the firm had added 2 new advisors since then without updated supervision protocols filed. I wrote carefully, not accusations, observations, patterns for examination, the language of someone who has spent 3 decades navigating regulatory processes, because that is exactly what I am. The wedding was on a Saturday. I dressed in the suit, arrived on time, sat in the row they'd assigned me, 8 rows back, off to the side, near the aisle at least. Amber walked down in a dress that made Kevin's face crumple in the good way, the way fathers recognize from 1,000 feet away because we've been watching our children's faces their whole lives. For the length of the ceremony, I wasn't thinking about any of it. I was just a father watching his son get married. That was enough. The reception was at a separate venue, a hotel ballroom downtown. They placed me at table 11, near the back, beside a column. My table mates were 2 of Preston's college friends who were pleasant and asked good questions about fishing when I mentioned I went most summers. I liked them. I was glad for that small thing. Around the second hour, I was getting a glass of water at the bar when I heard Claudette's voice carrying from a cluster of her friends nearby. Kevin's father is sweet, truly. Did you know we thought he could keep up with Preston at dinner? Preston had to cover the check. Laughter. Bless, he retired from county waste management or something. Salt of the earth, just not quite our world. One of her friends glanced in my direction, then quickly away. I set down my water glass. I walked across the room. The cluster of women watched me approach with that particular social wariness of people who aren't sure how much you've heard. Claudette, I said pleasantly, could I borrow the microphone from the band leader for a moment? I'd like to say a few words. She blinked. Of course, her smile didn't know what else to do. The band leader handed it over without hesitation. I faced the room. The conversation dialed down in waves, the way it always does when someone stands with the microphone and looks like they mean it. I want to say a few words about my son, Kevin. My voice carried easily. 32 years of presenting findings to review boards. Kevin was raised to believe that a person's value isn't measured by their zip code or their portfolio. He was raised by a man who spent 3 decades enforcing the laws that protect your water, your air, and your land. That man wasn't glamorous. He drove an old Civic and packed his lunch and went to work every single day, and he is prouder of that than anything else he's ever done. The room was quiet. Kevin, I found my son's eyes at the head table. You are the finest thing I've ever built. I hope you remember who taught you what integrity looks like. I handed the microphone back to the band leader. I walked back across the room. I heard the silence behind me, then the uncertain beginning of applause, then more of it. I retrieved my jacket from my chair, said goodbye to Preston's college friends, and left. I mailed the complaints the following Monday from the post office on Central Avenue. Certified mail, return receipt, copies kept. IRS, FINRA, Arizona Department of Insurance. All 3 went in the slot at 9:47 a.m. I noted the time in my file. Then I drove home and started my normal week. The call started on Thursday. Kevin first, his voice tight with something he was managing carefully. Dad, Amber's mom called me. She said there are complaints filed against her firm, with FINRA, with the IRS. She thinks you did it. I filed what I had standing to file. Dad, Kevin, did you hear what she said at the rehearsal dinner? Silence. Did you hear what she said at the reception? Longer silence. I heard about the reception, he said finally. Amber told me. And he exhaled. I don't know, Dad. I don't know what to do. You don't have to do anything, I said. I'm handling it. Preston called Friday morning. He was controlled, precise, the voice of a man accustomed to managing difficult conversations in boardrooms. Stewart, I think we should talk about what's happening. Happy to talk, I said. You run a clean firm, you have nothing to worry about. This isn't about the firm. This is about our families. With respect, Preston, your wife made it about families when she told a room full of people that I worked in waste management. She made it about families when she called me a janitor at the rehearsal dinner. I'm simply responding in the only language she understands. A pause. What do you want? I want nothing from you. I want your wife to understand that the man she dismissed runs circles around her in regulatory knowledge, and I want my son to be able to bring his father to Christmas dinner without hearing commentary about my car. Another pause. The FINRA issue is a matter of public record. The disclosure events are real. The failure to publish them in client materials is a violation of Rule 22.2's Zen. If your compliance team missed it, now they know. He didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice had shifted. Less boardroom, more actual. She didn't mean it personally. She can be thoughtless. She meant it personally, Preston. I've been reading people in professional settings for 32 years. She meant every word. He hung up eventually. I sat with the phone in my hand for a minute, then put it down and went to work in the garden. The following week was quiet on the surface. Underneath, I could track the movement through professional networks. Amber mentioned that Claudette had emergency calls with their compliance attorney. Kevin said that 2 client meetings had been postponed. A mutual acquaintance called to ask carefully whether I was doing okay, which told me Claudette's social network was running the same play Willard's had, painting me as unstable, unhinged, acting out of grief or confusion. I called back anyone who reached out. I was calm, clear, and specific. I explained that I had filed legally available complaints about publicly documented regulatory issues. Nobody argued with me. Most of them seemed more surprised than concerned. Amber called on a Wednesday evening. She was crying, but not the kind that wanted comfort, the kind that wanted truth. Dad, she'd been calling me that since the engagement. I'd always liked it. Tell me honestly, did you do this because of what my mom said? I filed it because the violations were real. But you wouldn't have looked if she'd been kind to you. I thought about that. No, I said, probably not. Is that wrong? She was quiet for a moment. I don't know. She was awful to you. She's been awful to you since the beginning. I've been trying to manage her and Her voice broke. I should have said something at the dinner, when she made that toast. Yes, I said, you should have. I know. I'm so sorry. I believe you. And I'll tell you what I told Kevin. I'm still your father-in-law. That doesn't change. But your mother needs to understand that the world doesn't divide neatly into her kind of people and the people who park cars for her kind of people. She laughed a little through the tears. She's terrified of you now. Good, I said. She should have thought about that in April. The FinRe review concluded after 11 weeks. Written notice of findings, 2 deficiencies confirmed in client-facing disclosure materials. Required remediation and a supervisory review. No fine, but a formal letter of requirement on file. That letter would appear in future broker check searches. Any sophisticated client researching Voss Wealth Management would see it. The IRS inquiry took longer. 6 months before I received confirmation of receipt and assignment to a review unit. 12 months before Calvin Bright called me to say he'd heard through the professional grapevine that Voss had hired a tax resolution firm and filed amended returns for 3 years. Amended returns meant they'd found something worth correcting before the IRS found it for them. Kevin told me later that the amended returns had cost his in-laws somewhere around $38,000 in back taxes and penalties. I was deadheading roses in my front yard on a Saturday morning in November when a car I didn't recognize pulled into my driveway. Claudette got out alone. She was dressed casually, which was unusual. No jewelry except small gold studs. She looked older than she did at the wedding, though it had only been 7 months. I set down the pruning shears. I didn't go to her. I let her come to me. She stopped a few feet away. She looked at the roses, then at me. I wanted to do this without Preston, she said. It seemed like it should be between us. All right. She was quiet for a moment. People like Claudette don't apologize often. I could see her working through the mechanics of it. I was unkind to you, she said finally. Consistently. I had decided before I ever met you that Kevin had married up, and I made sure you knew that. It was wrong. I waited. I don't entirely understand what I was protecting, she continued. My image, maybe. The story I tell about my family. You represented something I decided not to be, even though... She stopped. Started again. My father drove a city bus for 30 years. I've spent most of my adult life pretending that didn't happen, that I hadn't expected. I stayed quiet for a moment. I appreciate you saying that, I said. It takes something to say it. I'm not asking you to undo what you filed. I wouldn't. The violations were real. I know. She met my eyes. Preston says, You're exactly what you said you were. Someone who spent 30 years knowing where the bodies are buried and never once used it until someone gave him a reason. That's about right. She nodded once, looked at the roses again. They're beautiful. Karen planted them. My wife, before she died. I've kept them going 20 years. Something shifted in Claudette's face. Not pity, something more honest than that. I didn't know you'd done that alone. Kevin didn't tell you much about me, I said. I think he was trying to manage everyone's expectations. He shouldn't have had to. No, he shouldn't have. She left a few minutes later. We didn't shake hands. We didn't need to. Some understandings don't require ceremony. Kevin came by that afternoon, the way I'd suspected he might. He'd probably been parked down the street waiting to see how it went. He's always been transparent in that particular way ever since he was 8 years old, and would wait around the corner to see if I'd found the broken lamp before he confessed to it. He sat across from me at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he didn't drink. She told me it went okay, he said. It went honestly, that's better. He looked at his hands. I should have said something at the dinner and at the wedding. When she made the toast, I heard it. I sat there and I heard it, and I didn't. He stopped. I was scared of losing Amber if I made it a thing. I know. That's not an excuse. No, it isn't. I looked at my son. But I understand it. You're 31, and you love her, and you are in the middle of something you didn't know how to navigate. I'm 63. I've been navigating things like this since before you were born. He nodded, still looking at his hands. Are we okay, Dad? We're working toward it, I said. That's honest. We're working toward it. He came around the table and hugged me the way he used to when he was small, the kind of hug that has weight to it. I held on longer than I usually would. He left at dinner time. I stood on the porch and watched his car until it turned the corner. The street was quiet. Early November cold, the kind that doesn't bite but reminds you it can. I sat in the old porch chair, the one I've had since before Karen died, and I watched the light go. A neighbor walked her dog. A kid on a bicycle. The ordinary Friday of an ordinary street. I didn't feel like I'd won anything. It never felt like that. What it felt like was accurate, like a measurement taken carefully, the needle coming to rest exactly where the evidence said it would. I went inside when the cold got real, put a pot of soup on, found an old game on television that I half watched while I ate. Before I went to bed, I took the manila folder from the office shelf and put it in the filing cabinet with the rest of the closed cases. 32 years of environmental compliance, and one more thing set right. Some people spend their whole lives deciding who gets to be worth something. They do it with dinner checks and seating charts and careful little comments about zip codes and job titles. They think the quiet ones won't notice. They think the ones who drive old cars and pack their lunches and do their work without fanfare are too tired or too small to push back. They're wrong about that. They have always been wrong about that. I turned off the light and went to sleep. I still think about the roses sometimes. Not the complaints I filed, not the Finray letter, not the $38,000 in amended taxes. The roses. Karen planted them the year Kevin was born, and I've kept them alive for 20 years on my own, through every hard winter and every dry Arizona summer, because some things are worth the daily effort even when nobody's watching. That's what Claudette never understood about me. She looked at my 11-year-old Civic and my county pension, and she made a decision. She decided I was the kind of man who could be handled, set at table 11, near the column, given a polite smile and a dismissive joke, and quietly absorbed into the background of her daughter's new life. She thought quiet meant small. She was wrong. What happened to Claudette wasn't luck, and it wasn't cruelty on my part. It was cause and effect, plain and simple. She spent months making deliberate choices. The rehearsal dinner toast, the reception comments, the curated seating chart, the careful social maneuvering designed to make me feel like a lesser thing. Every one of those choices was a stone dropped in still water. The ripples were always going to come back. I just knew how to read water. I've been thinking about what it actually takes to get through something like this, with your dignity intact. And I don't think it's one thing. It's three things working together, and they have to be built over a long time before you ever need them. The first is knowing the difference between right and wrong and being willing to hold that line even when it costs you something. When Kevin sat at that head table and looked at his plate, I understood why. He was scared. Love makes you scared. But I had 32 years of practice, choosing accuracy over comfort, and that foundation held when I needed it to. The second is knowing your subject. I didn't win because I was angry. I won because I understood regulatory process, documentation standards, and the specific language that triggers mandatory review. Knowledge isn't abstract. It's the tool you reach for when someone thinks they've outmaneuvered you. Claudette brought money to a technical fight. That was her mistake. The third is the long game. It would have been easier and faster to make a scene at the rehearsal dinner, to confront Preston directly, to call Kevin every day until he took a side. None of that would have worked. What worked was patience. Not passive patience, but active patience. The kind where you keep your hands busy and your mind clear, and you trust that if you do the right thing the right way, the outcome will be accurate. When Claudette stood in my driveway that November morning and told me her father drove a city bus for 30 years, something shifted between us. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. She'd spent her whole adult life running from where she came from. I'd spent mine standing still in it. We'd both ended up at my rose garden on a cold Saturday, which is about as honest an ending as life usually offers. Kevin and I are working toward, okay. That's the truth. It's not a movie ending, but it's real, and I'll take real over clean every time. Some people will always sort the world into their kind and everyone else. They'll do it with dinner checks and guest lists and little jokes at rehearsal dinners. What they don't account for is the man who spent 32 years learning exactly how their world works, and who has absolutely nothing left to lose by using that knowledge. I turned off the light and went to sleep.